These people who work in the shadows are trying to establish a new world order, just like Hitler envisioned. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One world, one race, and one ruler. A new world order upon the ashes of all people and all sovereignty of all nations for all time. Brian, you were a lieutenant commander in the British Navy, is this correct?
That's correct.
You were in charge of a particular vessel?
HMS Orkney, which was an offshore protection vessel. But my main expertise was anti-submarine warfare.
In the past few hours, we have seen the abolition of the British Isles as a sovereign nation. How does this hit you, and is it not, in fact, the successful end to nation status, as would have happened had it been under Adolf Hitler?
You've given me several questions there. Firstly, I'm not shocked, because I'm one of a number of people, including yourself, who's been watching this come for a number of years. We've seen the beast break surface, so this is something that many people knew was coming, but a relatively few compared to the population as a whole. But we knew this was coming, and now it's broken surface and we can see it.
Well, are the British people so damned dumb? Are they so zombieized that they could not see this happening, and once having seen it happen, and it's in the front page of the newspapers, why haven't they reacted to the surrender of their nation to a Hitlerian super state through the European Union, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler envisioned in his book, The World Order?
Well, people haven't seen this because they have been deliberately dumbed down by an ongoing propaganda campaign, and I believe that that propaganda, that socio-political attack on people, has been occurring since the end of the Second World War. I can probably sum it up quite nicely with my father, who's 90 years old, and he said to me a little while ago, did I think that people in this country had changed? Because he said they've lost their humour, they've lost their willingness to stand up for their rights. They don't seem bothered about what's happening around them. And he said, did I think they changed? And my answer to him was no, they haven't changed, they have been changed. They have been deliberately changed by a socio-political economic attack. And that attack has been waged on the people of this country since the end of the Second World War, and it has been designed to dumb them down. The overall programme is very clearly illustrated in a matrix at the front of a book by Christopher Story called the EU Collective, Enemy of Its Member States.
Now, as I have gone around and talked to people in this island nation state, I see a lack of understanding of what freedom really is. They seem to have accepted what in the United States would be unacceptable. They seem to tolerate those things which would be intolerable.
I know that the Brits have been conditioned, but it's almost to the point of zombieization. Why?
Well, I'm just going to stick with the same argument that you are looking at generations now of British who have been subject to this propaganda machine, which has gradually narrowed their understanding of what freedom is into a limited window as defined by pure propaganda coming through the BBC or the so-called corporate TV channels and newspapers. But they haven't been reading the truth. They've been reading an increasingly narrowed explanation as to what freedom is.
In Britain, I see a lack of understanding of what freedom is. George Orwell talked about lies being the truth being lies. A complete, total distortion. And Orwell wrote his book within the confines of the BBC. How does all of this come into being?
We've got to go back in history to start to understand what has actually brought us to the condition where we've got people who are acting as zombies at the moment. What I believe when I look back is that for Britain, the war affected the whole of our society. It wasn't like America, where people in the more in the hinterland of the country weren't affected by the fighting. But for Britain, it affected the whole nation. So the moment the Second World War was over, people felt that freedom was the ability to do as they pleased and to enjoy themselves, to be free of the fear of the fighting and dying or being injured was freedom. And therefore they were happy to still accept, many of them, a very austere life. And that was freedom to them. Now in America, many people never had constraints on them through the war, so they continued to understand in America that what real freedom was, the ability to be able to speak your mind, to eat the food and the quality of food that you want, and also to have employment and to have your children educated in a way that you wanted. So all that was possible, particularly in America. In UK, the austerity of the post-war period meant that people were inherently constrained. What happened on top of that was that a propaganda program was implemented to capture people's minds and to tunnel them into a very constrained vision of freedom, whilst their freedoms were stripped away. Now, the evidence for this is overwhelming. It is well reported. In America, in 1963, in the Congressional Record, it was recorded by one of the United States senators that the US was starting to come under attack by a Marxist program. And the record, which is there for all Americans to see, clearly set out what was to be done. Children's education was to be dumbed down. Basically, women were to be, if you like, attacked in society in as much as their role was to be brought into conflict with the role of men. And this is where the feminist angle comes from. The church was to be attacked in an extremely big way because Christianity was to be destroyed. Politicians were to be ridiculed and undermined, and the national institutions were to be infiltrated with a view to slowly confusing and collapsing them.
Isn't that exactly what has happened here in the UK?
Absolutely, and this is one of my key points, that if you look for the evidence in history, it is all there, because if we come to the UK, we can see that exactly the same pattern has been used to subvert and then collapse.
Nazization of the nation by the same people who have been voted to prevent the Nazization of the nation and protect the liberty of the people.
You are absolutely correct, but I'm going to say perhaps for viewers you've jumped on one step a little bit too far. I want to bring you back. and say that if we look at the nature of the attack on society, it comes straight out of Marxist doctrine. This is absolutely clear, the evidence is overwhelming. And that brings us with a problem, or many people with a question. Well, aren't you talking Nazis, or are you talking communists? What we have to remember is one simple thing, that both the communist doctrine and the Nazi doctrine was founded on the works of Marx. And so if we see in the dictatorship that is establishing itself attributes which are slightly fascist or slightly communist, this makes complete sense because the baseline is Marx.
Well, Adolf Hitler said on February 5th, 1941, he said, basically National Socialism and Marxism are the same. The whole of National Socialism is based on it.
That is correct. So again, we have the raw evidence that the Nazi movement and the communist movement were working very comfortably to a Marxist doctrine. Now, what has happened is that we have been fooled into thinking that at the end of the Second World War, the Nazi doctrine disappeared, which it did not. The fighting was over, but the ideology was very much alive and well, and we know that many of the outright Nazis were allowed to move out of Germany. Many of them went to South America, but many went into the United States.
Is that through Operation Paperclip?
Through Operation Paperclip. And we had the same situation happening in Britain, that we had people who cleansed their identities and then came into Britain. We can also see through documents, through original Nazi documents, like the Europese Werkschaft, Gemeinschaft document, which was written in Berlin in 1942, that Europe was to be made a single political state with one currency, one transport system, and where the area was to be divided into regions, not countries, and Britain in particular was to be stripped of industry and reduced to a state or a number of states dependent on agriculture and tourism.
Is that not exactly what we're seeing here now?
It's exactly what we're seeing, and the best we could say, if you're pessimistic, you say this is an amazing coincidence that the European Union is implementing exactly the same policies that were set out in that original German document. So here we can see now that the European Union is dividing Britain up into regions, Scotland and Wales as two individual regions. Even our capital city, London, is designated a region under the European Union.
So would it be correct to say that the EU is Hitler's dream come true?
In my opinion, it is absolutely correct to say that, but I want to add one thing to that, is that it is Hitler's Marxist dream come true, because we can see that the European project itself is but one part in creating a global government. This is a Telegraph article on the Bilderbergers, who never tell us what they're doing, and in this document the Bilderbergers are quoted quite rightly as saying they're a shadow world government. And we can see already very clearly that the Bilderberg group, which again was founded immediately post-war under the chairmanship of a known Nazi, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, we have seen that organisation, the Bilderberg organisation, directing not only policy, major policy in countries, but selecting which politicians will be the one that implements that policy. So the undertone of it, even though we're talking Hitler at the moment and Hitler's dream, the undertone is Marxist. And this has an important connection if you move towards what's happening with the Agenda 21 and the environmental programs, because if you look at where the original base statements were made about preserving the world in this generation for future generations, that basic statement came from one sole source, which was the Communist Manifesto.
So we're talking about sustainable development of Agenda 21 being the program through which the property pirates can take over one's homes, their businesses,
Yeah.
and change the configuration of all countries for the benefit of the international banksters.
Absolutely correct. This is a corporate government setting a one world corporate government setting itself up, and the idea is to take property from individuals. We will not be allowed to own our own property, and that is to be taken away from us, but the regime does it by encouraging us to do the dirty works.
Are they pirates like the pirates of years gone by? They simply come in and steal
Well,
our property.
you can call them pirates if you like, but they're just criminals, because these people are lying with what they say, and then with their hand they're actually doing the exact opposite. We know that the next stage is the eugenics program, because we are now already seeing dialogue directed towards reducing population. So we've now got people such as Mr. Porritt, originally from Greenpeace, now saying that the British population should be reduced to 30 million. And this is a few years after the population has been deliberately inflated to near 60 million. So these people are now moving on to the next phase. And if you say to me, do I really mean eugenics, that they are going to selectively cull people, I have absolutely no doubt that that is what is going to happen if we allow it.
Is this eugenics program not in fact what Adolf Hitler began in the Third Reich?
Well, he did. He did. And again, history, when we really look into the historical facts, takes a twist, because if we look at where the Germans started to do terrible things to people, it was in the early programs called the T4 programs, where they started to experiment on physically and mentally disabled people. And before that work began, the people who would handle the victims were trained, the handlers were trained. And what was done is that they were desensitized so that they could take victims from wards, from convents, and from asylums, and use those people for experiments without feeling any compassion or guilt. Now, the training techniques that were used came not from Nazi Germany, but from Britain and within the Tavistock Institute. And this is one of the key factors today, that we can see that the Tavistock Institute, for example, is still driving policy forward. And it is a fact that in Britain we're now seeing very clear evidence that eugenics is being taught in schools.
Now, there was an individual named Adolf Hitler. Did he ever come to these islands?
There is a weight of evidence which says that after the First World War, Hitler fought in the First World War as a corporal in the German army. In fact, he was injured several times, and he also went blind after a gas attack.
There is evidence that you have that Adolf Hitler did in fact come to Great Britain in his early years, and it's rumored that he has gone into an organization called the Tavistock. Or am I incorrect?
Right. The evidence exists. I'd say that I believe that the evidence exists of the following events, and that is that shortly after the end of the First World War, Hitler came to Britain, and he came to Britain to visit a half-sister who at that time was living in Liverpool, and she met Hitler at the station. She was very concerned about him because he was very confused, almost rambling, and he had come to visit her not directly from the coast, but having been the guest of the Tavistock Institute in London. Now, this information that I'm putting forward, I personally still need to see the detail of it, but the weight of opinion of those who have followed the history of Hitler and how he became established are adamant that part of his early training was in London at the Tavistock Institute.
Who specifically runs the Tavistock group? Is this the international banksters, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, those who want to Frankenize the world?
Well, this is where life starts to get shades of grey. We know that the Tavistock Institute is consuming huge amounts of money, and from its early days it was given large grants from obviously extremely wealthy people. We know that the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers put money into the system. In particular, Mr. Rockefeller added American money to build up the American Institute of Psychiatry, and that was later to create the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Psychiatry in Germany, which was the main institute which began to get involved in those T4 programs, the eugenics for the disabled and the mentally disabled. So the Tavistock Institute, there's a lot of history which we know, but there's also a lot of things we don't know about the detail of the men who put the money into that institute. So in the background we can see events that happened. We don't know the exact people who were driving them, we don't know the exact people who wrote the checks, but we know the Tavistock Institute exists, and we can see in great detail how it has helped promote an agenda to do with the psychiatric industry and also the social industry.
Well, is not the British Constitution Group going to initiate some studies into those areas so we can, or you can, identify the enemy within, and we can be specifically pointing out how they have committed these crimes against humanity and what they intend to do insofar as reducing the population not only of this island but of the world?
Well, we've already started to do this, and across the country now, we will say we, but they're people working independently. There are researchers who are looking into the background of politicians who are currently in power. And when we do this, we find that, for example, in Tony Blair's New Labour Party, we are dealing with key people whose backgrounds are clearly linked to communism and Marxism. And these individuals, whether it's the Miliband brothers or it's Peter Mandelson, who have huge power and influence in Britain, but if you look at their background, it comes from a Marxist. The same is true of Mr. Gordon Brown. In his own biography, it's clearly stated that he was put into power with the help of Scottish communists. So we see the Marxist theme right the way through the New Labour project, and then in the wings we have the Conservative Party. And if we start to look at the Conservative Party, it's no coincidence that now we're back into looking at connections with the Nazi Party.
No, we have then a one-party system, so the people in control operate from both ends of the political spectrum, or the illusionary political spectrum, with the strings going up to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the
bankers.
Well, that is the banksters. Is it not?
Absolutely. So we have had a political system that even before the Second World War was offering two alternatives, and those alternatives were totally controlled. Many people are now talking about the Lib-Lab con in UK, and that is joking about the state of the parties, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, Lib-Lab, and the con is the Conservatives. So many of the people are conned by this regime, but I'm pleased to say that really over the last year in particular, we're now seeing people that look at the leaders of the three main parties and they realise they've come out of the same mould. If you look at Clegg from the Lib Dems, or you look at Tony Blair as our previous Prime Minister, or you look at the new boy in the Tories, Cameron, not only do they look the same, they use the same sound bites, they use the same hand movements, and there is a reason for this, and that is because they've actually been trained by exactly the same people. And this is not difficult to uncover, because if we have a look at an organisation with a Marxist background, and that is Demos, a so-called think tank in the UK, which helped set up the New Labour project.
Now, Cameron, did he not promise to have a referendum and then said, well, there is to be no referendum, we're simply going to declare the abolition of British sovereignty? And he has not only not allowed the British to vote on their own sovereignty, he has jammed it down their throat and up their ass.
Well, he said repeatedly, he was reported and quoted in the newspapers as saying that he would give the nation a vote on whether we wanted to be involved with Europe, a referendum, and yesterday it became very clear that he has reneged on that promise. He has lied, just as Tony Blair lied, just as the Liberal Democrat Party lies, because all three of them are committed to locking us into the EU project.
I didn't quite hear you. Did you say that they lied?
They lied.
Then they have a legacy of lies, is that not true?
They have a complete legacy of lies, because they have repeatedly told the general public that we shouldn't worry about this, it won't take sovereignty away, when in actual fact they were giving sovereignty away at each stage.
Prime Minister Ted Heath, who initiated the original schematic laid out by Adolf Hitler to surrender the sovereignty of this nation, is buried over at Salisbury Cathedral. He told us that this was just to set up a trade agreement initially, and then he lied and the people believed him, and then they were betrayed, and this betrayal has gone from Heath all the way on down to now, where Cameron has said, well, you don't have a right to vote on your own sovereignty. You are no longer free.
We've been lied to all along, and each time we dig back into the evidence, the documentary evidence of history, we can see that there are connections between people in power and the Nazi Party.
Who wasn't the Astors supported by the Nazi Party, or somehow linked?
Well, they were extremely supportive of the Nazi movement, both through Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British fascist movement. I believe I'm correct in saying that his signature appears in the Astor family guest book, and the Astor family continued their links with Oswald Mosley after the war period, and the Astor family is also linked through to the German ambassador to the UK immediately pre-Second World War, and that was von Ribbentrop. So it seems a big coincidence that we have one of the major families who helped get Mr. Cameron into leadership of the Conservative Party. I believe they gave him about £2.4 million for his leadership campaign. So that family, with links through to the fascist movement, has now helped to support the leader of the Conservative Party.
But he's supposed to be exactly the opposite of the fascist, and yet he is the personification of just what he professes to be against.
Well, this is the art of the underlying Marxist doctrine, which is to lie. If you tell a big enough lie long enough, it will deceive the wider public, and that was one of the known doctrines of the Nazi propaganda movement.
Cameron is being groomed to be the next Prime Minister, is he not?
He's been groomed to be the next Prime Minister ever since he took leadership of the Tory party.
And with distinctive Nazi ties.
Well, he's married into the Astor family, and that Astor family historically was sympathetic to the Nazi movement.
And Prime Minister Ted Heath was being compromised Well, he was covertly gay and doing the boys in the bum, as I'm told.
That is what many of us believe, that Ted Heath was not the gentleman he was presented to the British public. He was in fact an extremely perverted man with links through to the Nazi movement, and he attended the 1936 Olympic Games, and again I think I'm correct in saying he sat about 4 rows behind Hitler, which shows that there was some known connection between Ted Heath and the Nazi movement.
In the Night of Long Knives, did not Hitler eliminate the huge homosexual population that was in the SS?
Well, he did, and they were either eliminated at the time or they were given pink badges and sent to the concentration camps. So for the gay movement in both the US and the UK at the moment, they're in a very vulnerable and dangerous position, because I believe that this fascist Marxist movement will in fact turn on them.
So the Nazization of this nation is really a continuation of the policies of Adolf Hitler, not through war, but rather through treaty. And we have the schematic once laid out by Hitler for a European Union come into full force with the Lisbon Treaty, and Cameron, again with an association through the Astors back to the Nazis, is calling for an acceptance of the unacceptable without any referendum. And then we see in the beginning, the paper that you hold in your hand, Britain, the end. And what is it? The referendum, say, Tories, Britain, the end. The Lisbon Treaty becomes law. We've been sold down the river, and at the top of the building of the Parliament we have the EU's flag. It might as well be the Nazi swastika. Why has this been accomplished without the objection of the British people?
Because the attack on the British people this time has not been with guns or bullets or bombs. It's been done by psychological warfare, and that is a critical part of the Nazi document, of the Nazi military doctrine, and it is a critical part of the communist doctrine, that the way to win over Western powers is by infiltration and subversion and destroying the fabric of the society within. And this is why we have seen over 30 or more years in UK the slow crumbling away of our infrastructure. Our industry is gone. Our schools are teaching nothing. We have no respect for institutions. We have drunks on the streets. We have children being taken away from their parents. And all of these policies have been implemented by both the so-called Socialist Labour Party and the more right-wing Conservative Party. They are in fact two sides of the same coin.
So we're seeing the Nazization of the nation. We're seeing the prostitution of our people. We're seeing them systematically enslaved. But one thing comes to mind. Slavery cannot exist without the acceptance of the slaves. Now the British Constitution Party is drafting a constitution.
Well, one can never go right by going wrong. One can never travel from where we are to where we plan to get if we do not do something.
Will those who have sold out our liberties be allowed, with the new document, to vote on it? And if so, wouldn't they just let it expire, as they have the sovereignty of this nation?
Well, the point is, these people have given away sovereignty and the right of this government, the right of this nation to govern itself. They've given it away. But the fact they've missed is that in giving those powers away, they've actually given their own powers to govern away. And that means that it is now perfectly acceptable, indeed it's right, that the British people take back the government of themselves, for themselves. So we simply need to build a new government system alongside this corrupt Liberal Democrat, Labour, Conservative con.
Then your vote for the Constitution of Britain has to be set in motion apart and aside from the system that you have where they can manipulate the vote, massage it, where they can propagandize the people to accepting again the tyranny that you now face.
To fight these people, you have to understand the methods by which they work. And they have attacked us, they have nearly destroyed us by using techniques of subversion, infiltration, subversion, socio-political, economic warfare. We have seen the deliberate dismantlement of Great Britain from the inside. Now, once you understand that, you start to see it, and many people now approach the British Constitution Group and they say, we've woken up, we can see it, we can see that these people are traitors, we can see that they have deliberately destroyed the country and weakened the population to allow them to install a dictatorship.
The people that you have working within the Constitution Group are doing investigations into the criminal activities of those who have made this happen and who have been behind the scenes for so long, surrendering the sovereignty.
Yes.
Will they then, or will you then, not call for their imprisonment for acts of high treason, as you did in this conference on the 31st of October in London?
Yep. We are doing that, and we will continue to do that. We already have groups of people who have gone to police stations around the country with the documentary evidence of treason, and we are calling for our politicians to be brought to book, to be tried for crimes of high treason.
If you liked what Hitler did, you would certainly love what Blair and Bush was spelling, and you would certainly like what Obama and Brown are about to do. They want to kill you. See, this isn't a question mark. This is a reality. I'm saying it is a reality. They want to kill you on the Georgia Guidestones, which is America's Stonehenge. They've got something in stone, written in stone. It says we want to reduce the population of the earth. We want to do away with the useless eaters, because a man is black. He's without boundaries. My children are neither white nor black. They're the human race.
We know they're worried about this, because that is why Tony Blair in particular spent so much time in trying to remove the treason laws from our Constitution.
Well, hasn't Brown been advocating Blair to be head of the
Because they are just
neo-Nazi
EU.
EU?
Absolutely, because they are partners in crime. And it's quite obvious that when they first came into Parliament, they were a double act to deceive the public. Brown was never elected to the position of Prime Minister. He was simply installed in position, and this is something many people forget. So Gordon Brown is a false Prime Minister. He was never elected to the post, and he's simply been the runner for Tony Blair. He's continued to install Tony Blair's policies while Tony Blair is moved on to become the president of the European Nazi program.
It has been said that if you liked what Hitler did, you'll love what Blair and Brown and Obama has done to bring about a new world order. Do you see a similarity between Blair and Bush and Brown? Do you see the Nazization of America, and are you not going in the same direction as we are financially with the abolition of any currency that is backed by gold or silver, any currency that is backed by anything other than hot air and hand claps?
Well, the three men are the same because they've been liars from the start. They've lied throughout their terms in office. They've lied to the American people. They've lied to the British people as they have constructed a fascist dictatorship. And we're seeing a totally parallel system occurring. What's happening in America is happening in Britain and vice versa. So the three men are clearly the same. The destruction of the US dollar and the British pound is also happening in parallel. The American dollar is to be collapsed, and that is going to happen in the very near future. And the American dollar has to be collapsed because the collapse of the dollar is really the only way you can defeat America.
And usher in a new global currency. They're talking about the Amero, and they're talking about the North American Union, the Nazi agreement.
Yeah.
I say Nazi because it is Nazi-like in structure, and the collapse of the dollar would be necessary before they could introduce a world currency.
Absolutely. But the other thing the collapse of the dollar is designed to do is to unsettle the whole of the world economies so that the relative wealth of the world can be balanced as they see it. And that means that the wealth of America and Western nations is to be severely depressed to bring us on a par with the third world. We are all to be reduced to poverty, and we are to have private property taken away from us because that is an inherent part of the fascist manifesto.
You have a thing here called the Stonehenge.
We do.
In the United States, we have something called the Georgia Guidestones,
Yes.
which is like the Stonehenge, except that at the top,
Yeah.
and if you take a look at the top of the screen, you'll see that their intention is to reduce the population of the planet by 90%.
Yes.
So if we take a look at the population of England, which is about
60 million.
60 million, if we just simply reduced it by, well, 90% of 54 million, then the 6 million remaining could be used as a servant class for the super rich.
That's absolutely true. Slave labour, effectively. But that's what we already are, because we know that we're working for a banking system which is totally fraudulent in its production of money, in the value of money, and in the raising of taxes. We know that we are working in a fraudulent corporate constitution which has been deliberately constructed to deceive the people.
The British Constitution Group is doing something that has not been done before, introducing a new constitution, a constitution that has never been laid out since the Magna Carta. We have an opportunity to guarantee freedoms for these people for all time, and at the same time exposing the banking bastards, that criminal cassius cartel that controls our currency and our commerce. This is extremely significant. What are you doing through the UK column to make this dream a reality?
Well, the simplest thing that we've done from the start is we're telling people the truth, and we're telling people the truth about what's going on without mincing our words. We're using real words to describe what's happening. Many people in politics today will not use proper English. They shy away from it under the politically correct establishment. But we started out by saying that our government were committing treason, our politicians committing treason. We know that there is a criminal banking elite established which is ruining the country. And so by telling people the truth, using the correct language, not succumbing to political correct speech, and also ensuring that when we talk to people we provide the evidence for what we say, we are now starting to see a remarkable change in people. In the last year, all of the key activists across the country are saying the same thing, that people are hungry for knowledge. They know that something bad is going on, but they can't quite see it, but they want to find out more. So when they see our work, they read the UK column, or they're looking at videos on the internet, or your work, or all of the other people who are speaking out about the New World Order. These people are opening their eyes, and they even say to you, when I woke up. So they describe the change from the zombie state, which you mentioned earlier, to the state of understanding what is really happening. They've gone from a state of not understanding what's going on but being anxious, to actually saying that they can see what's happening, they can see the betrayal and the treachery and the fraud and the corruption.
Do you welcome the entrance of the Free World Alliance in opposition to the United Nations?
I think this is a fundamental thing, because people need to understand that the United Nations is not a benign or a benevolent organisation. It is 100% evil. The aim of the United Nations is to form the world government, and it is already directing and setting policy within countries. So the American population believe that it is the American government that's setting policy. We believe it's the British government. That is not true. Much of the fundamental policy affecting our lives is coming through from the United Nations.
Now, at your meeting, I stood up and unilaterally recognized a nation of 40 million people, a linguistic tribal nation state in Africa, existent within the borders of what is now described as Nigeria. We can recognize these independent tribal, linguistic, racial, religious, and political nation states around the world.
Well, it shouldn't be we can. We have
We
to.
are,
We have
and
to,
we shall.
We must, because those are the fundamental building blocks of societies, and that is the way the world is supposed to work. We are not supposed to work in political regions where lines have been drawn arbitrarily on a map. This is the con of the United Nations programme. You've mentioned Africa. We already know that there is a movement to break Africa up into regions.
Well, this would prevent that, and shall prevent that. And the very first nation that we recognized was right there on the floor. Everybody said, yes,
Absolutely.
we accept it.
Yeah.
It's simply having an acceptance of the reality that has been denied by the Cassius criminal cartel, the evilarchy.
I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. It's not just Hattie Chanescu. Lawful rebellion in the United States and Great Britain. There's two flags up here. We'll bring people on both sides of the pond together. In doing that, in forming a free world alliance, that is our strength against the United Nations. A world free is not united. A world united is not free. I spoke to a black gentleman over here. There's a fellow who spoke, and then there's a fellow who was with him. And I went over and he gave me his card and it said Prince something or other, and I found out he was with the Yoruba tribe. The clan, the linguistic nation group in Nigeria, which has 40 million people. It's about half the size of England. They're suppressed. And I said, I want to do an interview with you. Let us take this prince, an attorney, who's part of the Yorubas. Let's recognize their linguistic nation state. We recognize them. Hell, let us all recognize them now. We can do that. Unilaterally, we just did. There are those under the gun of government who will join us when we support them. It isn't to try to get them to change. They are individuals. They have their own sovereignty. They have their own liberty. They want to do things in their own country in their own way. When we do that, we don't force the integration of of 5 tribal groups into one nation. That has to be dissolved. We have to reconfigure the borders of the world. We have to recognize these 40 million people who are begging for independence. All we have to do is do what has never been done before. It's just a matter of thinking it out. In a very short period of time, I would like to see, with your help, little bits and clips of individual statements from this lady here, from this lady here, from you, and you at the back of the room. We can easily put in 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000 clips addressing every single issue of the war that has been conducted against us. 5 to 6 to 7 million, it's not a problem. If 1 million can see a film before a book can be read by one, if 1 million can see a film before a book can be read by one, we can easily go to that computer. This man right here. He's going to take bits and clips. You're going to put it out on the net. What?
Okay, definitely.
I didn't hear it.
Definitely.
Yes. It's a definite. If we lose, it's only because we didn't do anything.
It's a fascist system. It is a fascist system. It is a fascist system. It is a fascist system.